Well, Dragapult has officially won the Lille Regionals in a mirror match finals, and it feels like the first time in forever that Dragapult has actually won a major event. Gardevoir did not find its way into the top 8 at this event, and really in the top 16, I think there was 1 or 2. So overall, Dragapult had a really good time at this event. Dragapult's been a very interesting deck because for the longest time, it's felt like very overpowered, it felt like a really good deck, but I feel like as of recently, people are kind of, I'm not going to say hating on it, but they've definitely counted the deck out. Going into this weekend, a lot of people were kind of saying online that, you know, this is the best position Dragapult has been in a long time, with Charizard recently winning, like all these other decks popping up. Like, Dragapult's a deck that can kind of deal with everything else. It just has a couple bad matchups. Of course, it managed to win the whole event. I felt like every time I turned the stream on, I was watching Dragapult, so it was really cool to see as a Dragapult player myself. I really like this deck, and I'm glad to see that it still has the potential to win major events. I'd say pretty much entirely we've moved away from the straight Dragapult build, and pretty much every Dragapult build now plays Dusknoir, or even I guess Dragapult Charizard is still a thing, but for the most part we're seeing Dragapult with Dusknoir just because that is the most powerful version, and one direct counter to that strategy was printed, which is Psyduck. So today I want to kind of talk about Psyduck and why I think it's not really the answer to beating Dragapult. Dusknoir is honestly what makes Dragapult so good because it opens up the possibility for so many different plays. A lot of times you can just go for plays that your opponent does not see coming, like we actually witnessed on stream going for a 6 prize card turn.
Looks like he's going to be going for it here as the Dusknoir takes out the Gardevoir on the bench, and that's going to be 2 prize cards for Alberto. Let's see, is the Hawlucha available?
Night Stretcher.
Is it going to be?
We got it!
There it is, Hawlucha onto the 2 bench Pokemon, putting them both in range, as they both have 30 HP remaining. 200 onto the active, 30 to both bench Pokemon. Alberto with the 6 prize turn.
So even when you think you see all the plays in front of you, sometimes it will still just catch you off guard. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Let's talk about Psyduck here, the 70 HP Pokemon with the Damp ability, which prevents all Pokemon in play from using their abilities that require them to knock itself out. So with this, there's really 3 Pokemon it kind of affects here, Dusknoir, Dusclops, and also technically Magneton, which I'll talk about. That one's not as big of an implication here, but I'll still mention it, of course. So obviously we have Dusknoir and Dusclops with the Curse Blast abilities. So with Dusknoir, you're able to knock yourself out and place 13 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon. Same thing with Dusclops, except that it's 5 damage counters instead of 13. So basically when you have a Psyduck in play, it just shuts this ability off entirely. So you're not able to use it until that Psyduck is removed from the field. And like I said, this obviously applies to Magneton as well, which has an ability where you're able to knock yourself out to attach up to 3 basic energies from your discard pile to one of your electric Pokemon. So same thing with this, it will just sit there. You cannot knock it out, you cannot use its ability until that Psyduck is removed. This one I say is not as big of a deal because Miraidon is like a non-existent deck right now, and not even every build of Miraidon plays this card, but just still something to kind of note that it does shut off this ability as well. So here we have Aleksander's winning Dragapult list from this past weekend at Lille. As you'll notice, we've got the 2-2-1 line of Dusknoir, you know, Dusclops, Duskull. Pretty much right now across the board, that's what Dragapult's playing. Basically every build I'm seeing has that same line of cards right there. Really with Dragapult, what we're kind of seeing is differences in like the number of bosses orders, Night Stretchers, Dragapult EXs. Some people are running 2, some people are running 3. We're seeing some Brock Scoutings in some lists are playing Rare Candy. But this right here is a pretty good list as far as like what we're pretty much seeing across the board. That 3rd boss is something that I feel like is kind of new. For the longest time, people were just running 2 bosses orders. Now we're adding that 3rd one. For certain matchups, it definitely makes sense just to have a heavy bosses orders in the deck. So this right here is a pretty much standard build, I would say, of Dragapult. And yeah, there's a couple of things with this list to kind of note as far as countering Psyduck, which I will point out in just a minute here. But just take a good look at the list. If you're not familiar with Dragapult, this right here is pretty much standard across the board. And we do have a lot of answers to deal with Psyduck to where it's really not that big of a deal, I feel like. First and foremost, this is the most obvious play here to get rid of Psyduck. So Psyduck has 70 HP, which is a blessing and a curse. It means you can find it with Buddy-Buddy Poffin. But it also means that with Dragapult, you can hit it with Phantom Dive, and you can also play Hawlucha, which adds that extra damage counter, and Psyduck is gone within 1 turn. That's like the easiest way to deal with Psyduck, and a lot of times this is how we just get rid of it off the board. Because of that, we're only kind of seeing Psyduck pop up in decks that play Mist Energy. Mist Energy prevents this Pokemon from taking those damage counters from Phantom Dive. So essentially, if there's a Mist Energy on Psyduck, the only way to really get rid of it is to boss it up and just you know, hit it with Phantom Dive directly, not by placing damage counters, by hitting it for 200 and kind of wasting your damage essentially. It feels really bad to have to use Phantom Dive on this directly because you could be taking bigger knockouts. But sometimes that's the case, you know, if this thing has missed energy, it can be annoying to deal with. And really the only other way to deal with it would be Enhanced Hammer, which Dragapult is not playing at all, because you have no way to reliably find Enhanced Hammer. So really, missed energy is kind of what makes Psyduck worth it. So in decks that naturally play missed energy, it just kind of makes sense. Right here we have, you know, recent decks that have done pretty well. Every Mega Absol deck is playing missed energy. Every Pidgeot Control is playing Mist Energy. Every Charizard is playing a copy of Mist Energy. Really the only decks that we see that aren't playing Mist Energy that are still somewhat playing Psyduck are going to be Zoroark and then also Grimmsnarl. I will say with Grimmsnarl, we're not really seeing Psyduck as much anymore. And that's already a matchup that feels kind of okay for Dragapult as long as you don't have a really bad start. So besides those two decks, for the most part, we're just seeing Psyduck in these decks that play Mist Energy, and that's the reason why, because if you can attach Mist Energy to Psyduck, it can be very annoying to deal with. I forgot to mention Crusto because that's also there, but Crusto, of course, also plays Mist Energy, so another way to just deal with it. But here's to deal with Dragapult, right? So I think Dragapult with Psyduck is a little bit different from decks that like get countered by Shaman, like Terrabox, for example. You know, Shaman really shuts down Terrabox. It makes that matchup, whatever it is, you know, if I'm playing Dragapult and I add a Shaman to my deck, I can deal with Terrabox a lot better, right? And I think a big reason for that is because with decks like Terrabox, where you're able to bench snipe with damage like that, for the most part, they're decks that are way more aggressive, right? Like, you want to be turn 2, you want to go for Torrential Pump and start taking knockouts. With Dragapult, especially with using Dusknoir, you have that ability to, you know, be more aggressive, but for the most part, it's a comeback deck. It's a deck where you want to set up your board nicely and go for that big turn at the end of games. So it really doesn't bother you necessarily if there's a Psyduck on the field early game, because you're not really going for that play just yet anyways, if that makes sense. If Psyduck is on the board, you can still develop your board. You have a natural draw engine with Drakloak. You can really just set up your board and just kind of set it up for the late game. And the thing about a deck like this is you're playing 4 copies of Iono. So even if your opponent is taking knockouts and they have a Psyduck on the board, you can kind of trade those knockouts because you're still hitting Phantom Dive, which is an insane attack. You're still kind of keeping up for the most part. And then you're also just kind of setting up that late game Iono, where you kind of Iono them down and getting rid of their draw power, getting rid of the cards essentially, to where at the end of the game, you can kind of just knock out the Psyduck and set up the Dusknoir play. Again, I do think the most annoying usage of Psyduck is going to be in Mega Absol, just because they also play Munkidori, so they can move damage back to your side. So it's very kind of annoying to deal with, but especially in a deck like Charizard, like the builds that don't play Munkidori anymore, they don't really have a way to move that damage back. Honestly, what you could do is just go for Phantom Dive, put 60 on the Psyduck, and then just kind of keep it there, and essentially whenever you're ready to pop off, just put Hawlucha down, it knocks it out, and you can go for your big play. On top of that, we don't necessarily need Hawlucha either. I mean, we do also have Munkidori, where we can move damage from our side of the board to the Psyduck and then hit for Phantom Dive and knock it out. Again, really the only kind of, I guess, issue with Psyduck is if you have a Mist Energy on it, it makes it a lot more annoying to deal with. But again, Dragapult is a deck that's very versatile. It's a slower deck, it's a comeback deck, not a deck where you have to play as aggressive. And no, you know, going into this weekend, a lot of people were opting to play some rare candies in the deck. But what I've noticed is a lot of the top lists from this past weekend don't play any rare candy. We're kind of going back to that slower build of Dragapult. And again, it's just more consistent. It allows us to set up. If there's a Psyduck on board, you know, that's cool. We're going to continue setting up. I can continue item locking you. I can keep preventing you from playing the game. And then I can just keep swinging for Phantom Dive. You know, 200 plus 60 is not a bad attack. And it can kind of deal with a lot of cards naturally. Obviously, Dragapult by itself was a deck for the longest time that didn't play Dusknoir whatsoever. So it's not like it's a bad deck without Dusknoir. It's just Dusknoir kind of gives it that extra potential just to kind of pop off at the end here. But again, we have ways to kind of deal with it. You know, we have the Iono to kind of hand disrupt whenever we're ready to kind of knock out that Psyduck. So whether that's, you know, putting damage on it and then Ionoing and then finishing it off with Phantom Dive or whatever the case might be. You know, we have ways to kind of deal with it, and especially with the heavy bosses orders as well, we have ways to kind of gust it up. Yeah, it kind of feels bad sometimes to have to hit it naturally with Phantom Dive, But at the same time, you know, a lot of these decks, they play other Pokemon, obviously. So a lot of times you can kind of set yourself up for another big turn afterwards. And like I said, the thing about it is, you know, even if you have to boss up the Psyduck and knock it out like that, you can place that damage elsewhere and kind of deal with other things. Like I said, I do think that Kangaskhan is the best user of Psyduck. I feel like it's very annoying to deal with Psyduck plus Mist Energy plus Munkidori. That's where it kind of becomes a problem. And I feel like in those matchups, you definitely have to kind of reroute your gameplay a little bit, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to lose right off the bat. Like, the thing about Dragapult is you always have ways to kind of work around things. You never really feel like you're going to lose a matchup necessarily. You do have bad matchups, obviously, but for the most part, I always feel like I have a chance with this deck. So in conclusion here, is Psyduck worth it? In my opinion, I think it's only worth it for decks that play Mist Energy, but for the most part, I think it's only worth it in Absol. I just don't think that it necessarily is something that you need in other decks. I think as Dragapult kind of gets more popular here, you can always include it, but a lot of times it's kind of that decision of, you know, do I want to cut something for consistency to add this one card for a matchup that I might not even see that day? Obviously, if Dragapult continues to kind of rise in the meta share, then it's going to be more worth it, but I feel like right now it just kind of makes sense for certain decks, but not all decks, if that makes sense. Because again, I think cards like Shaman, for example, for decks like Terrabox, which are more aggressive, you know, it kind of makes more sense because they're trying to go turn 2 Torrential Pump, and if you shut that down, you just kind of flip the matchup. I feel like with a card like Psyduck, I feel like Dragapult is just a slower deck in general. Obviously, it's nice to be able to go for Dusknoir whenever you want, but for the most part, if you put a Psyduck down, you know, I'm just going to play slower and kind of set up more and build my board a little bit better. And then once I'm ready to go for that pop-off turn, that's what I'm going to kind of go for that play. And don't just take my word for it. If you kind of look back at the regionals and kind of the interviews a lot of times with Dragapult players, especially with Milwaukee, a lot of times they kind of ask, you know, how has the impact of Psyduck been? Is that something you were worried about? And for the most part, a lot of them just said, not really. I do feel like Psyduck is a good card in general, but I just feel like Dragapult has so many ways to still deal with it. The only way it makes it annoying, in my opinion, is with Mist Energy, especially with a deck like Absol, where they have Mist Energy, and let's say you've already got a Dusclops or a Dusknoir on board. If they try to boss that up and you have no way to really move it, it can be very annoying because you're kind of just stuck there while they're continuing to set up. So I do think that's why it is kind of essential in general right now with Dragapult to go ahead and play Professor Turos. It's just a nice card to have. It can be very annoying to have a Dusknoir on board and they bring it up to the active spot and you're essentially just stuck. You have no way to retreat it. But yeah, I just think Dragapult's in a really good spot right now. I think we got plenty of ways to deal with it. You know, they try to put a Bravery Charm on Psyduck. We've got Jamming Tower. They've got Mist Energy. We'll just boss it up and knock it out. And if they just have a Psyduck on board, I've got Hawlucha, I've got Munkidori, Phantom Dive. I've got plenty of ways to deal with it. Those are just my thoughts on the card. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I promise this is not just Psyduck propaganda as I head to Vegas with Dragapult. I honestly think that Psyduck is a good card. I just don't think it's worth it in the majority of decks. Like I said, the only deck where it really kind of bothers me or is just harder like to win those matchups, I feel like, is with Kangaskhan. Because even with decks like Charizard, for example, the Charizards that are doing good are the Dusknoir builds that don't play Psyduck. So the ones that do play Psyduck aren't playing Dusknoir, and I feel like when they're not playing Dusknoir, like, we've got plenty of ways to kind of win that matchup naturally anyways. So yeah, like, it just feels like if you're already losing the matchup, you're not going to win it by just throwing Psyduck in there. I feel like the Absol matchup is definitely more even, or even maybe a little bit more Absol favored, and then the addition of Psyduck makes it even more favored for them. So I feel like that's why it's so good in that deck. But yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you subscribed if you enjoyed it. Got more videos coming your way, and I'll catch you guys the next time.
In this format, though, the Mega formats, Psyduck exists. Has that been a problem at all for you?
You know, Psyduck isn't too bad. Not many people are playing it, and the people who are usually because they already have a bad matchup into Dragapult, so usually it might make the matchup better for them, but it's probably still favorable for Dragapult. The only matchup where it's really annoying is in the Mega Absol deck, because it swings that one from a pretty favorable matchup to pretty unfavorable, I think. But besides that, it's not too bad.